The clock on the mantelpiece struck 3, a hollow metallic sound that seemed to bruise the heavy silence of the room. It had been exactly 7 days since the earth had claimed Ethan, yet the house remained stubbornly inhabited by his absence. Amelia sat in the corner of the velvet armchair, the one Ethan used to call the throne of unfinished books, and felt herself fading. To the people milling about the Grand California estate, she was a blur in the periphery, a smudge of black silk against the white marble. She was the widow, yes, but in the eyes of the Walker bloodline, she was merely a temporary tenant, a footnote in a legacy that was now being aggressively reclaimed. The air in the house was thick, not with grief, but with the suffocating scent of lilies and expensive cologne. It was the smell of a funeral that refused to end, a staged mourning performed by people who were already mentally measuring the drapes for their own offices. Amelia pulled her shawl tighter. She could still smell him, the real him. Not the lilies, but the faint grounding aroma of cedar wood, old parchment, and the espresso he drank every morning at 5 a.m. It clung to the heavy velvet curtains, hiding in the folds of the fabric like a secret. Every time the wind stirred, she closed her eyes, letting the scent deceive her heart into believing he was just in the other room, perhaps looking for his mislaid spectacles or humming a tune he couldn't quite remember. "Amelia? Are you even listening?" The voice was sharp, a shard of glass cutting through her reverie. Margaret, Ethan's mother, stood by the fireplace, her face a mask of practiced stoicism. She held a crystal glass of water as if it were a scepter. Beside her, Vanessa, Ethan's sister, was scrolling through her phone, her thumb moving with an indifference that felt like a physical blow. "The lawyer will be here in 10 minutes, Margaret continued, her tone devoid of the warmth one might offer a grieving daughter-in-law. "I suggest you compose yourself. We have much to settle, and Ethan would have wanted things orderly." Orderly. The word felt like a lie. Ethan was a man of storms and sudden laughter, of quiet midnight talks about the stars and the terrifying beauty of being alive. He was never orderly with his love. He gave it in chaotic, overwhelming waves. "I don't need the money, Margaret," Amelia said, her voice a thin thread of sound, barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "I just want to be here, in his space, a little longer." Vanessa looked up then, a small cold smile playing on her lips. "We all want things, Amelia. But the world keeps turning. This house is a Walker asset. It's part of a history that existed long before you married into it, and it will exist long after." The cruelty was so casual it left Amelia breathless. She looked around the room, at the paintings they had chosen together in flea markets in Paris, at the rug where they had sprawled out to watch old movies, at the piano Ethan played when he thought no one was listening. To the women standing before her, these were assets. To her, they were the geography of a shared soul. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life. She watched as distant cousins whispered in the hallways, their eyes darting toward the antique vases. She watched the lawyer, Mr. Sterling, enter with a briefcase that felt like a coffin for her future. The grief she carried wasn't a heavy stone. It was an ocean. It was vast, rhythmic, and terrifyingly deep. 7 days. They say the human body replaces most of its cells every 7 years. But Amelia felt hers were being replaced every hour with sorrow. Every cell that once knew his touch was dying, being replaced by a version of herself that Ethan had never known. That was the real tragedy. She was becoming a stranger to the woman he loved. As the family gathered in the library, Amelia took her seat at the very back of the room. The mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the faces of greedy mourners like a distorted dream. She stared at the empty chair at the head of the table. That was Ethan's place. In her mind's eye, she saw him sitting there, winking at her, perhaps reaching under the table to squeeze her hand when the talk became too dry. She could almost feel the warmth of his palm, the rough callus on his thumb from years of drafting designs. "Stay brave, Mel," he used to whisper when things got hard. "The world is loud, but the truth is usually found in the quiet." She clung to those imagined words as Mr. Sterling opened his briefcase. The sound of the latch clicking open was like a bone snapping. "We are gathered here to read the last will and testament of Ethan Thomas Walker," the lawyer began, his voice a drone that seemed to push the air out of the room. Amelia didn't care about the numbers. She didn't care about the Walker Global shares or the offshore accounts the ants were whispering about. She was listening for a different kind of inheritance. She was waiting for a word, a sentence, a clause, that acknowledged she was his home. She wanted the world to hear that she wasn't just a passenger in his life, but the person who held the map. But as the reading progressed, a cold dread began to seep into her bones. To my mother, Margaret Walker, I leave the primary estate in Beverly Hills and 40% of my liquid assets. To my sister, Vanessa Walker, I leave the secondary properties in Aspen and the vintage car collection. Name after name. Asset after asset. The list went on like a ledger of her displacement. The more Mr. Sterling read, the more Amelia felt herself being erased. It was as if Ethan were systematically stripping away every layer of protection he had ever wrapped around her. She looked at Margaret, who was nodding with a grim satisfaction. She looked at Vanessa, who was already texting, likely a realtor or a jeweler. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird. "Ethan, where am I?" She cried out in the silence of her mind. "Where did you put me?" She remembered the way he had looked at her the night before he died. He had been so pale, his breath a ragged struggle, but his eyes were burning with an intensity she couldn't understand. He had reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched her cheek. "I've made sure, Amelia," he had wheezed. "It's all in the foundation. Look for the house that breathes." At the time, she thought it was the delirium of the end. Now, she realized it was a riddle she was failing to solve. "And finally," Mr. Sterling said, pausing to adjust his glasses. The room went unervingly still. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. "To my wife, Amelia Walker." Amelia leaned forward, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. This was it. The acknowledgement. The anchor. "I leave the property located at 402 Blackwood Road, rural Gallatin County, Montana, including all structures and contents therein, as is." A silence followed, heavy and confused. Then, a soft snicker broke it. It was Vanessa. "Montana." Vanessa whispered, not quite quietly enough. "The old hunting shack? The one that's been boarded up since the 80s. Margaret let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Well, it seems Ethan knew where your true tastes lay, Amelia. A quiet place for a quiet girl." The humiliation was a physical heat rising in Amelia's chest. A shack. A ruin in the middle of nowhere. Thousands of miles from the life they had built together. It wasn't just a meager inheritance. It was a public shaming. It was Ethan telling the world, and her, that she was worth nothing more than the dust in a forgotten house. She looked at the lawyer, searching for a sign of a mistake, a missing page, a hidden codicil. But Mr. Sterling only offered a look of professional pity. "That concludes the distribution," he said, closing the folder. The room erupted into a flurry of movement. The vultures were ready to feed. Margaret and Vanessa stood up, already discussing renovations and the new era of the Walker name. No one looked at Amelia. No one offered a hand. She sat in her chair, a ghost in a black dress, surrounded by the scent of a man who had apparently forgotten her name before he died. The sun was beginning to set, casting long bloody shadows across the library floor. The 7th day was ending. The mourning period was over. Amelia stood up, her legs shaking. She walked to the window and touched the velvet curtain one last time. The scent of cedarwood was fainter now, dying beneath the weight of the lilies. "Ethan," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Why did you leave me in the dark?" There was no answer. Only the sound of the rain starting to tap against the glass. A cold rhythmic weeping that promised no comfort. Only the long, lonely road ahead. She didn't know then that the house in Montana was not a grave, but a seed. She only knew that the man she loved had left her with a ruin, and the night was coming on fast. The air in the library had turned predatory. It was no longer the sacred silence of a sanctuary, but the sharp, thin oxygen of a high-altitude hunt. Amelia watched as Mr. Sterling straightened the silk edges of the documents. Every crinkle of the paper sounded like a tectonic shift, a grinding of the earth beneath her feet. Across the table, Margaret sat with her spine a rigid line of ancestral pride, her hands folded over a designer handbag that cost more than the average person's annual mortgage. Vanessa, beside her, was a portrait of bored elegance, her eyes flitting toward the window as if the sun itself were an appointment she was running late for. "Let us be precise," Mr. Sterling murmured, his voice cutting through the thick layer of unsaid things. "The primary holdings, the Walker Global shares, the Santa Barbara estate, the vineyard in Napa, and the venture capital accounts, are to be divided strictly between Mrs. Margaret Walker and Ms. Vanessa Walker, in accordance with the 2018 amendment. A soft collective exhale swept through the room, the sound of attention finally snapping. Margaret didn't smile, she was too refined for that, but her chin rose a fraction of an inch, a silent reclamation of the throne. Amelia felt a strange numb hollow opening in her chest. It wasn't the loss of the money. It was the clinical way they were dissecting Ethan's life, as if he were nothing more than a series of ledger entries. To them he was a portfolio. To her, he was the man who used to get the hiccups when he was excited and who always smelled like rain and old books. "And what of the widow?" Margaret asked. Her voice was like a velvet glove draped over a fist of iron. She didn't look at Amelia. She spoke of her as one might speak of a piece of furniture that had outlived its aesthetic purpose. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, a dry, uncomfortable sound. He looked at Amelia for the first time, his eyes briefly betraying a flicker of something. Was it pity? Or perhaps the guilt of a man who knew he was about to deliver a killing blow to someone already wounded. "Regarding Amelia Walker," he began, his voice dropping an octave. "The decedent has bequeathed a single specific property. Deed 704B. A residential plot in Gallatin County, Montana. Known locally as the Blackwood Cabin." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was brittle. Then, a sound escaped Vanessa's throat, a sharp staccato burst of air. A laugh. It was a cruel, crystalline sound that shattered the last of the room's dignity. "The Montana cabin?" Vanessa repeated, her voice dripping with incredulity. "The one Dad bought in the 70s for a tax write-off? The place with the dry rot and the leaking roof that Ethan used to joke was the only place on earth where the wolves lived better than the humans." Margaret's lips curled into a faint, mocking shadow of a smile. "Ethan always did have a sense of irony. It seems he wanted you to have a place that matched your background, Amelia. Simple, rural, isolated." The humiliation was a slow-acting poison, seeping into Amelia's veins. It wasn't the poverty of the gift that hurt. She would have lived in a tent if Ethan were there to hold the stakes. It was the public stripping of her worth. In front of the family, in front of the law, in front of the memory of her marriage, she was being told that she was an outlier. An intruder who had been tolerated for a season and was now being sent back to the wilderness. "There must be more," Amelia whispered. The words felt like sandpaper in her throat. "Not because I want it, but because he loved me. He told me he would take care of me." "He did take care of you," Vanessa snapped, her boredom replaced by a sharp, defensive greed. "He gave you a roof. If it leaks, that's hardly our concern. You came into this family with a suitcase and a library card. Amelia, you're leaving with a house. I'd say you've made quite a profit." Profit. The word felt like a slur. Amelia looked down at her wedding ring, the simple gold band that felt suddenly, agonizingly heavy. She remembered the day he had slipped it onto her finger in a small chapel in Maine. There had been no lawyers then. No Walker Global. Just the sound of the Atlantic crashing against the rocks and a man who promised that his heart would always be her home. Had it all been a lie? "Is there a cash stipend for the upkeep?" Mr. Sterling asked, his voice sounding distant, as if he were calling from the bottom of a well. "No," Margaret answered for him, her tone final. "The will is clear. The Montana property is the totality of her inheritance. The liquid assets are already being transferred to the Walker Trust. Amelia has 48 hours to vacate this house." The room began to spin. The faces of the relatives, the aunts in their pearls, the cousins in their tailored suits, seemed to blur into a chorus of judgmental ghosts. She could feel their eyes on her, measuring her failure, savoring her fall. The waitress from the coast had finally been put in her place. Amelia didn't cry. She couldn't. The grief was too deep for tears, a cold, subterranean river that had frozen solid. She stood up, her movements slow and mechanical, like a doll with broken springs. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling not with anger, but with a profound soul-crushing confusion. She looked at the empty chair where Ethan should have been. "Ethan, why would you let them do this?" But the chair remained empty. The only answer was the sound of Vanessa's pen scratching against a checkbook, a sound like a scythe through wheat. She turned to leave the room, her footsteps silent on the expensive Persian rug. As she reached the door, she heard Margaret's voice one last time, cold and dismissive. "Don't forget to leave the keys to the Mercedes on the hall table, dear. The car is an asset of the estate. You can take the bus to the airport. Or perhaps a train. I hear the scenery to Montana is quite lovely this time of year." Amelia didn't look back. She walked out of the library and into the cavernous hallway, where the shadows of the afternoon were stretching out like long, grasping fingers. She felt small. Smaller than she had ever felt in her life. She wasn't mourning a fortune. She was mourning a truth. She was realizing that the man she had whispered her deepest fears to, the man who had held her through the night and promised her forever, had looked at her in his final moments and decided she was worth only a ruin in the dirt. The humiliation was a weight in her lungs, making every breath a struggle. She reached the grand staircase and looked up toward their bedroom, the room where they had dreamed, where they had laughed, where he had died. It was no longer hers. It was a Walker asset. As she climbed the stairs to pack the single suitcase she had brought with her 3 years ago, the first clap of thunder rolled over the hills of California. The sky was bruising, turning a dark, sickly purple. The world was preparing to wash her away. And as she stepped into the bedroom, she realized with a piercing, heart-stopping clarity, she was no longer a wife. She was a trespasser. The sky over California didn't just rain that night. It mourned with a violent, jagged despair. Amelia stood in the center of the bedroom, the space that had once been her sanctuary, watching as two men in gray uniforms, strangers hired by Margaret, moved with a clinical, heartless efficiency. They weren't just moving furniture. They were deconstructing a life. They handled her vintage vanity as if it were scrap wood and packed away the linens that still held the faint, fading warmth of Ethan's presence. "The mistress says everything not explicitly mentioned in the personal effects list stays," one of the men said, his voice devoid of any human resonance. He took a hand-carved wooden bird from the nightstand, a gift Ethan had whittled for her during a summer in Maine, and set it aside in a box labeled Estate Assets. "That was a gift," Amelia whispered, her hand reaching out, then dropping. "It has no value to anyone but me." "Orders are orders, ma'am," he replied, not looking up. The betrayal of the inanimate objects was almost more than she could bear. The walls she had painted a soft seafoam green, the sunlight she had curated with sheer curtains, the very air she had filled with laughter, it had all turned traitor. The house was rejecting her, vomiting her out like a foreign cell. Downstairs, the sound of Margaret's sharp heels clicked against the marble like a countdown. "Amelia! The car for the airport will be here in 20 minutes. I expect you to be on the driveway," Margaret shouted from the foyer. There was a cruel vibration in her voice, a triumph she no longer bothered to hide. Amelia clutched the handle of her single battered suitcase. It was the same one she had arrived with, a cheap, scuffed thing that smelled of her old life. Inside were a few sweaters, a handful of books, and the silk scarf Ethan had bought her on their first anniversary. It was all she had left of a 3-year marriage. Everything else had been reclassified as property. As she descended the grand staircase, her legs felt like lead. She looked at the portraits on the wall, the heavy oil paintings of Walker ancestors who seemed to sneer at her as she passed. She was a ghost being exorcised. At the bottom of the stairs, Margaret and Vanessa stood like twin sentinels of ice. Vanessa was holding a ring box, the velvet box that held Ethan's grandmother's emeralds, which Amelia had worn to every charity gala. "The keys, Amelia," Margaret said, extending a cold, manicured hand. With trembling fingers, Amelia reached into her pocket. The metal was cold. She placed the keys to the house and the car into Margaret's palm. The clink of the metal was the sound of a door locking on her soul. "And the house key you're holding?" "The one for the Montana place," Vanessa asked with a smirk. "I'll keep that," Amelia said, her voice finally finding a spark of steel. "It's the only thing Ethan left me. Even if it's a ruin, it's mine." Vanessa laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Keep it. Use it to keep the coyotes out." Then, Margaret did the unthinkable. She grabbed the handle of Amelia's suitcase. "You've lingered long enough. This house needs to breathe again. It needs to be purified of distractions." With a strength born of pure malice, Margaret dragged the suitcase toward the massive oak front doors. She flung them open, and the roar of the storm rushed in, a wall of cold, wet wind that extinguished the candles in the foyer. "Go!" Margaret commanded. She shoved the suitcase out into the night. Amelia watched, paralyzed, as it tumbled down the stone steps and landed in a deep, muddy puddle at the bottom. The latch popped, and the corner of a white sweater. A sweater Ethan used to love because it made her look like an angel, soaked up the black, oily rainwater. Amelia was pushed forward, stumbling out onto the portico. The heavy doors, 6 inches of solid, unforgiving oak, swung shut with a sound like a gunshot. Thud. The silence that followed was louder than the thunder. Amelia stood in the dark, the rain instantly drenching her thin coat, turning her hair into wet ribbons against her face. She looked back at the house. Through the frosted glass of the door, she saw the lights in the foyer dim. They were already turning them off. They were erasing her before she had even left the driveway. She walked down the steps, her shoes squelching in the mud, and knelt beside her suitcase. She tried to tuck the white sweater back inside, but her hands were shaking too hard. The rain felt like needles, cold and indifferent, washing away the scent of the house, the scent of the life she had built, the scent of him. In that moment, standing in the drenching dark of a California night, Amelia realized the most terrifying truth of all. Love was not a monument. It was not a fortress. It was a narrative, and the walkers had simply edited her out. Ethan was gone, and with him, the only version of her that mattered had died too. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a homeowner. She was a woman standing in the rain with a broken suitcase, holding a key to a house she had never seen, in a land she didn't know. She looked up at the darkened window of their bedroom. "Did you mean for this, Ethan?" She sobbed, the sound lost in the wind. "Was I just a temporary thing to you too?" There was no answer, only the relentless rhythm of the rain hitting the pavement. She stood up, gripped the wet handle of her suitcase, and began to walk toward the gate. Every step was a goodbye to a dream she had thought was her destiny. She was leaving with nothing but her name and a heavy heart, unaware that in the pocket of that soaked white sweater, tucked deep in the lining, was the small, cold key that would eventually unlock a truth more powerful than all the gold in California. The bus station was a cathedral of the broken, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that hummed with a low, anxious frequency. Amelia sat on a plastic bench, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin like a cold shroud. The water from her suitcase had seeped into everything, and the scent of damp wool and exhaust fumes now replaced the expensive jasmine and cedarwood of her former life. When the Greyhound bus arrived, it hissed like a dying beast, its metal skin scarred by years of salt and grit. Amelia boarded with the ghost of a woman she no longer recognized. She took a seat at the very back, leaning her forehead against the window. The glass was vibrating, a constant jarring tremor that seemed to echo the rattling of her own heart. As the bus pulled away from the curb, the lights of the city began to stretch and blur into long weeping lines of neon. She watched the silhouette of the skyline, the glittering towers where Ethan had conducted his business, the hills where they had watched the sunset, slowly sink into the horizon. With every mile of asphalt that passed, the distance between Amelia the wife and Amelia the vagabond grew into a chasm. The road grew rougher. The smooth highways of the coast gave way to the cracked, neglected veins of the interior. Inside the bus, the air was stale, thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, old upholstery, and the quiet, heavy desperation of the other passengers. Beside her, an old man slept with his chin on his chest, his breath a ragged whistle. Across the aisle, a young woman clutched a crying infant, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the dark window. They were the invisible ones. The discarded. And for the first time, Amelia realized she was one of them. In the suffocating rhythm of the engine, the questions began to bite. They started as whispers, but grew into screams. Who was Ethan Walker? She closed her eyes and tried to summon his face, but the image was fracturing. She remembered him bringing her tea in bed, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he laughed at her silly jokes. She remembered him holding her hand during a thunderstorm, whispering that she was his anchor. Was that man real? If he had loved her, how could he have left her to this? How could a man who claimed she was his greatest treasure leave her to be tossed out like a bag of refuse? The humiliation of the will reading began to rewrite her memories. Every kiss now felt like a calculation. Every "I love you" sounded like a hollow echo in a canyon of lies. "You were a ghost even then, weren't you, Ethan?" she whispered against the cold glass. She began to wonder if she had been a character in a play he had written. A temporary lead actress in a domestic drama that had reached its final curtain. Perhaps his kindness was just a form of politeness, a way to keep the house quiet while he built his true legacy for the people who shared his blood. The bus hit a deep pothole, jolting her head against the frame. The pain was sharp, but it was a relief from the dull ache of her thoughts. She pulled her wet coat tighter. She felt a terrifying lightness, as if the lack of money, the lack of a home, and the lack of a husband's protection had stripped away her gravity. She was floating in a void, moving toward a destination that felt like the end of the world. Montana. A place of jagged peaks and unforgiving winters. A place where things went to be forgotten. The night deepened. The stars outside were hard and distant, like diamonds scattered on black velvet. They didn't look like the stars they had gazed at from their balcony in California. Those stars had been romantic, shimmering with possibility. These stars were cold. They were ancient witnesses to human suffering, indifferent to the woman shivering on a bus seat. Amelia reached into her pocket and felt the jagged edge of the key to the Montana cabin. It felt like a piece of shrapnel. Is this my punishment? She wondered. For believing in a fairy tale? For thinking a girl with nothing could ever truly belong in your world? She felt a surge of anger, a hot, flickering flame in the middle of her frozen soul. It was easier to be angry than to be broken. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to take the memory of his smile and tear it into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to believe he was a monster, because if he was a monster, then her loss was a narrow escape. But as the bus groaned up a steep mountain pass, the anger faded, leaving only a hollow, echoing sadness. Because deep down, in the part of her heart that was still bleeding, she remembered the way he had looked at her on his last night. That look wasn't a lie. It was a plea. She was a woman traveling through a dark, nameless nowhere, pursued by the shadows of a love that might have been a hallucination. The bus roared into the heart of the continent, carrying her further from the woman she was and closer to the ghost she was becoming. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to touch the horizon, Amelia had stopped crying. Her eyes were dry and burning. She watched as the landscape transformed into a vast, empty expanse of brown earth and skeletal trees. She was no longer running away. She was being erased. And as the bus sign flickered with the name of a town she had never heard of, she realized that the hardest part of the journey wasn't the miles she had traveled. It was the realization that she was going to a house built of shadows, to find a man who might never have existed at all. The bus hissed to a stop at a crossroads that seemed to exist only as an afterthought of the earth. When Amelia stepped down, the gravel crunching beneath her thin-soled shoes, the silence of Montana hit her like a physical weight. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library. It was the prehistoric, indifferent silence of a landscape that didn't care if she lived or died. The air here was different. Sharp, thin, and smelling of pine resin and ancient stone. It bit into her lungs, a cold reminder that she was no longer shielded by the temperate luxury of the coast. She walked for 2 miles, dragging her suitcase. The wheels, already damaged from the night and the rain, shrieked against the dirt road, a lonely mechanical cry that echoed off the surrounding hills. By the time she saw the silhouette of the Blackwood cabin, her breath was coming in ragged gasps, and her hands were blistered. She stopped at the edge of the property, and the last shred of hope she had been clinging to, the secret hope that perhaps the house was a hidden gem, a cozy cottage, shattered. The house was a skeletal wreck. It sat huddled against a backdrop of jagged snow-capped peaks, its timber darkened by decades of neglect. The porch sagged like a broken jaw, and several windows were boarded up with rotting plywood. The fence was a series of leaning teeth, and the yard was a graveyard of tall, yellowed grass and rusted machinery. It wasn't a home. It was a warning. Amelia felt a laugh bubble up in her throat, a hysterical, jagged sound that turned into a sob. "Is this it, Ethan?" she cried out to the empty valley. "Is this the taking care you promised?" She collapsed onto the bottom step of the porch, her forehead resting on her knees. The weight of the humiliation finally settled over her. Margaret and Vanessa were right. She had been sent here to rot, to be swallowed by the vast, uncaring beauty of the wilderness until there was nothing left of the woman who had dared to love a walker. Despair, heavy and suffocating as a wet wool blanket, began to pull her down. She thought of the pills in her suitcase, the ones for sleep she hadn't touched. Maybe sleep was the only inheritance left that made sense. But then, a scent caught the wind. It was faint, so subtle it felt like a memory rather than a physical sensation. It was sweet, heady, and entirely out of place in this land of pine and dust. Jasmine. Amelia raised her head, her eyes red and burning. She looked around the wasteland of the yard. There, tucked in the sheltered angle where the porch met the house, a spot protected from the brutal Montana wind, sat a large weathered stone pot. Inside it, defying every law of the local climate, was a jasmine plant. It was lush, its dark green leaves glossy and vibrant, dotted with tiny star-shaped white flowers. It looked like a miracle dropped into a ruin. Amelia stood up, drawn toward it as if pulled by an invisible string. As she reached the pot, she noticed something even more impossible. The soil was damp. It had been watered recently. How? This house had been abandoned for years. The nearest neighbor was miles away. She knelt beside the plant, her fingers trembling as she touched a delicate petal. This was her favorite flower. Ethan used to fill their bedroom with it every spring because he said it reminded him of the secret garden of her soul. "If you ever lose your way, Mel," he had joked once years ago, while they were planting a small garden in their California backyard, "just look for the jasmine. It's the only flower that knows how to find its way home in the dark." At the time she had laughed, kissing his nose, thinking it was just his usual poetic rambling. Now, the memory surfaced with the force of a tidal wave. She looked closer at the pot. It was heavy, made of cast iron, and decorated with a faint motif of a compass. Underneath the overhanging leaves, nestled deep in the damp soil at the base of the plant, she saw a glint of metal. She reached in, her fingers dripping with dark earth, and pulled out a key. It wasn't like the rusted heavy key she held in her pocket, the one that supposedly opened the front door. This key was modern silver, and bore the engraving of a small stylized bird, the same bird Ethan had whittled for her, the one the movers had snatched away as an estate asset. Her heart didn't just beat. It hammered. A strange, cold electricity raced through her veins. This wasn't the neglect of a man who had forgotten her. This was the meticulous planning of a man who was hiding something. She stood up and looked at the front door. It was locked with a heavy rusted padlock. But she didn't try the padlock. She began to walk around the perimeter of the house, her eyes scanning the foundation, her mind racing back to his final words. "It's all in the foundation. Look for the house that breathes." She found it on the north side, hidden behind a stack of rotted firewood. A small, inconspicuous door, barely 3 feet high, built into the stone base of the house. It looked like a coal chute, but as she cleared away the debris, she saw a silver lock plate. She inserted the key. It slid in with a smooth, buttery precision that belonged in a Swiss bank, not a Montana shack. Click. The door didn't just open. It hissed as if equalizing pressure. Amelia crawled through the opening, her heart in her throat. She expected a cellar, dark, damp, and smelling of earth. Instead, she found herself in a small, tiled vestibule. As she stood up, a motion-sensing light flickered on, revealing a short hallway lined with clean white walls. The air here didn't smell like the ruin above. It was filtered cool, and carried that same faint scent of cedarwood and parchment. She followed the hallway to a heavy steel-reinforced door at the end. There was no keyhole here, only a digital keypad. Beside it was a small brass plaque with a quote etched in Ethan's handwriting. "For the woman who taught me that the heart is the only true compass." Amelia's breath hitched. She knew the code. It wasn't a birthday or an anniversary. It was the coordinates of the small main chapel where they had married. She entered the numbers with shaking fingers. The door hummed and retracted into the wall. Amelia stepped inside and froze. She wasn't in a cellar. She was in a high-tech sanctuary. The room was a masterclass in understated elegance, a private study filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a mahogany desk, and a wall of monitors that were currently dark. It was a nerve center, a hidden world beneath the rot. On the desk sat a single cream-colored envelope with her name on it. Beside it was a modern, biometric safe and a black leather travel wallet. Amelia approached the desk as if she were approaching an altar. Her hands shook so violently she had to grip the edge of the mahogany to keep from falling. She opened the travel wallet first. Inside was a passport she didn't know she had, a secondary one, and a first-class, one-way plane ticket from Salt Lake City to Zurich, Switzerland. The departure time was 10 hours from now. She sank into the leather chair, the same model Ethan had in his California office. The contrast was a physical blow. The ruin above, the world-class hidden fortress below. The humiliation of the will, the rain, the bus, the laughter of Margaret and Vanessa. It all began to shift, reconfiguring itself into a new, terrifying picture. The broken house in Montana wasn't a punishment. It was a filter. Ethan had known that Margaret and Vanessa would never set foot here. He had known they would laugh at the shack, and leave it to rot. This was the only place on earth where they wouldn't look. The only place where Amelia could be truly alone, and truly safe. She looked at the jasmine plant through the small reinforced glass slit that acted as a window to the outside world. The plant was kept alive by an automated irrigation system, hidden beneath the dirt. He had planned this. He had anticipated his own death, he had anticipated his family's greed, and he had built a path through the thorns for her to walk. But as the unease stirred in her chest, a new fear took hold. If Ethan had gone to these lengths to hide her, what was he hiding her from? And if his love was this deep, this calculating, then the man she thought she knew, the simple businessman, was a shadow. She reached for the cream-colored envelope, her thumb tracing the familiar slant of his handwriting. "Ethan," she whispered, the name a sob and a prayer. "What have you done?" The silence of the room was different now. It was no longer the silence of the dead. It was the silence of a clock, ticking toward a revelation that would change the world, and her, forever. The silence in the underground study was absolute, the kind of silence that exists only in the deepest parts of the earth or the quietest corners of a broken heart. Amelia sat in the plush leather chair, her wet, mud-streaked clothes a jarring contrast to the pristine elegance of the room. She felt like a stain on a masterpiece. Above her, the floorboards of the ruin groaned under the weight of the Montana wind, a reminder of the rotting facade Ethan had built to cradle this secret. "Who were you, Ethan?" she whispered, her voice cracking in the still air. She reached for the biometric safe. It was a sleek, obsidian cube recessed into the mahogany bookshelf, looking more like a piece of modern art than a security box. There was no keypad, only a glass sensor. With a trembling hand, she pressed her thumb against it. A soft, melodic chime echoed through the room. "Accepted." The door of the safe didn't swing open. It slid back with a sigh of pressurized air. Amelia braced herself. She expected stacks of cash, the cold glitter of diamonds, or perhaps the deeds to the properties Margaret thought she had won. She expected the inheritance the world understood, the kind that can be measured, taxed, and envied. Instead, the safe was nearly empty. At the bottom lay a single, black leather travel wallet and a small, weathered photograph. Amelia picked up the photo first. It was a candid shot of her, taken years ago on a beach she didn't recognize. She was laughing, her hair caught in the wind, looking at someone off camera with a gaze of such pure, uncomplicated devotion that it hurt to look at. On the back, in Ethan's hurried script, were the words, "The only world I ever wanted to rule." The tears she had been holding back since the bus station finally spilled, hot and stinging. They blurred the edges of the travel wallet as she opened it. Inside there was no money. There was a first-class ticket to Zurich, Switzerland, departing tomorrow morning from a private airfield 2 hours away. Tucked behind it was a small, encrypted USB drive and a handwritten note on heavy cream vellum. "Amelia," the note began, the ink slightly smudged as if his hand had been shaking when he wrote it. "If you are reading this, the world has become very cold for you. I know you are hurting. I know you feel abandoned, standing in the dust of that old house. Please, forgive me for the theater of the last 7 days. I had to let them take everything. I had to let them humiliate you. If Margaret and Vanessa believed you had even a penny of my real life, they would never let you go. And I needed you to be free." Amelia let out a choked breath. She looked around the room, at the walls lined with books on international law, global logistics, and maritime history. This wasn't the library of a simple California businessman. This was the war room of a ghost. "The man you married loved you with every breath," the letter continued. "But the man the world knew was a mask. I have spent years building a labyrinth to keep you out of the reach of the shadows I walked in. The Walker Global they are currently dismantling is a decoy, a shell designed to collapse under the weight of its own greed. Let them have the debt. Let them have the ruins." Amelia's heart thundered. She stood up, her eyes wandering to a large oil painting on the far wall. It was a hauntingly beautiful depiction of the Swiss Alps, the peaks sharp and white against a bruised violet sky. She realized now it wasn't just art. It was a window. She walked to the desk and plugged the USB drive into the monitor. The screen flickered to life, displaying a map of Europe dotted with glowing nodes. Each node represented an asset, a foundation, a sanctuary. None of them bore the name Walker. They were held in trusts named after her. Her middle name, her mother's maiden name, the name of the street where she grew up. He had hidden an empire in the folds of her own history. You weren't leaving me with nothing, she sobbed, clutching the letter to her chest. You were giving me everything by making it look like nothing. The weight of his sacrifice began to settle on her. To protect her, he had allowed himself to die in her eyes as a failure, a man who had left his wife to the wolves. He had accepted her potential hatred, her certain despair, and her public shame, all to ensure that when the dust settled, she would be the only one left standing in the light. She looked back at the plane ticket. Zurich. The heart of the world's silence. Beneath the ticket, she found one last item in the wallet. A small, silver pendant in the shape of a compass rose. She put it on, the cold metal resting against the hollow of her throat. It felt like a tether, pulling her toward a future she couldn't yet imagine. The room began to feel smaller, the walls closing in with the gravity of what lay ahead. She wasn't just Amelia Walker, the grieving widow from the California coast. She was the keeper of a secret that could move mountains. She looked up at the ceiling, toward the rotting house above where the wind continued to howl. Up there, she was a beggar. Down here, she was a queen in waiting. But the cost was the man. She would have traded every hidden gold bar, every Swiss account, and every square inch of this high-tech sanctuary just to have him back for 1 minute. To tell him she understood. To tell him that he didn't have to be a ghost to be her hero. I'm going, Ethan, she whispered into the cool, filtered air. I'll follow the map. She gathered her things, the ticket, the photo, the drive. She didn't take the clothes she had arrived in. They belonged to the woman who had been defeated. She found a plain, dark cashmere coat hanging in a small closet, likely placed there by someone Ethan trusted. As she prepared to leave the study and climb back through the house that breathes, she stopped at the door. She reached out and touched the mahogany desk one last time. The secret life of Ethan Walker was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a mission to be completed. He had spent his life building a fortress for her. Now, she would spend hers making sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. She crawled back out into the Montana night. The storm had passed, leaving the air crystalline and the stars blindingly bright. She looked at the jasmine plant, its white flowers glowing like fallen stars in the moonlight. She wasn't shaking anymore. The cold was still there, but it didn't reach her heart. She picked up her broken suitcase, not because she needed what was inside, but because it was the last thing that tied her to the woman who had survived the rain. Tomorrow she would fly. Tomorrow, she would begin to reclaim the narrative. But tonight, she stood in the shadow of a ruin, a quiet woman carrying the weight of a silent man's love, ready to cross an ocean to find the truth of who they both really were. The Montana dawn was a thin, bruised line of gray on the horizon when Amelia stepped out from the shadow of the cabin. She looked like a survivor of a shipwreck, her face pale, her eyes etched with the weariness of 1,000 lifetimes. But beneath the exhaustion, a new cold clarity had begun to take root. She sat on the edge of the sagging porch, the silver compass pendant heavy against her skin, waiting for a sign, any sign, that she wasn't just chasing a ghost into the fog. Then, her phone vibrated. The sound was jarring in the immense, rural silence. It was a sharp, digital cry that felt like a pulse. She pulled the device from her pocket, the screen cracked from the fall in California, the glass splintered like her old life. A message illuminated the dark. It came from an unknown international number, the country code prefixing a sequence of digits that looked like a cipher. Come to the airport. Bring nothing but yourself. Everything is prepared. Amelia stared at the words until they burned into her retinas. She didn't ask who it was. She didn't ask how they knew she was there. In the strange orchestrated logic of Ethan's afterlife, she simply knew. This was the second beat of his heart, reaching out from across the Atlantic to guide her home. The realization hit her with a force that made her gasp. This wasn't abandonment. It was never about being cast out. It was a hand reaching through the dark to pull her out of a burning building. Ethan hadn't left her in the rain. He had pushed her into it so she wouldn't smell the smoke. Every humiliation she had endured, Margaret's sneer, Vanessa's laughter, the cold mud of the driveway, was merely the price of her invisibility. To the world, she was a broken widow. To the unseen architects of Ethan's true legacy, she was the mission. She stood up, her legs no longer trembling. She looked at her suitcase, the wet, mud-caked bag filled with the remnants of a woman who no longer existed. Bring nothing but yourself. She took a deep breath, the scent of the jasmine plant behind her providing one last anchor of comfort. Then, with a deliberate trembling hand, She let the suitcase go. It tumbled into the tall yellowed grass, a discarded cocoon. She didn't need the sweaters Ethan loved. She didn't need the books. She didn't even need the wedding ring she had been clutching. She took the ring off. It was a beautiful hollow symbol of a marriage the world had tried to erase. She placed it carefully on the petal of a jasmine flower. "I'm coming, Ethan," she whispered. "I'm bringing the only thing you ever really asked for. Me." A black SUV appeared at the end of the dirt road, its headlights cutting through the morning mist like the eyes of a silent predator. It didn't belong in Gallatin County. It was too clean, too fast, too purposeful. It pulled up to the gate, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. He didn't speak. He simply opened the rear door and waited. Amelia walked toward the car. She felt light, almost weightless, as if she had shed her skin. As she climbed into the leather interior, which smelled of the same cedar wood that filled the hidden study, she looked back at the ruin of the Blackwood cabin. From the outside, it was still a tragedy. A rotting monument to a man's supposed failure. But now she saw it for what it truly was. A masterpiece of camouflage. A temple of shadows. As the car began to move, whisking her away from the only home the law said she possessed, her phone buzzed one last time. "The path is narrow, but the destination is yours. Do not look back." The tears came then, but they weren't the hot, jagged tears of the bus station. They were quiet. They were the tears of a woman who finally understood that love doesn't always look like a soft bed and a warm hearth. Sometimes love looks like a storm. Sometimes love looks like a lie told to keep the truth alive. She watched the Montana peaks recede in the rearview mirror, their jagged edges softened by the rising sun. She was a woman stripped of her past, her property, and her name. She was a woman who had lost everything the world could measure, only to find the one thing the world could never touch. Direction. She closed her eyes as the car sped toward the airfield. She wasn't running away anymore. She was being summoned. And across the ocean, in the cold, precise heart of Switzerland, the life Ethan had built for her was waiting to breathe. The private airfield was a ribbon of gray asphalt etched into the vast golden silence of the Montana prairie. There were no crowds, no frantic announcements, no smell of stale coffee and desperation that had defined her journey on the Greyhound bus. Here, the air was cold, thin, and tasted of the coming winter. A Gulfstream jet sat waiting, its engines whining with a low, predatory hum that vibrated in Amelia's chest. It was a sleek, silver needle designed to stitch the world together. As the black SUV pulled to a halt beside the airstrip, Amelia stepped out. She felt a phantom weight on her arm where her suitcase should have been, but her hands were empty. She was a woman who had been hollowed out, a vessel carried only by the momentum of a dead man's will. A flight attendant stood at the base of the stairs. She didn't ask for a passport. She didn't ask for a ticket. She simply bowed her head slightly, a gesture of profound, unsettling respect, and said, "We've been waiting for you, Mrs. Walker. Please." Amelia climbed the stairs, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. As she stepped into the cabin, the door hissed shut behind her, sealing out the world that had spent the last week breaking her. The interior was a sanctuary of cream leather, polished walnut, and silence. On the central table sat a single crystal glass of water and a small plate of the exact pastries Ethan used to buy her from a tiny bakery in Carmel, the ones with the orange zest and the dusting of sea salt. Amelia sank into a chair that felt like a cloud. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back was a stranger. Her eyes were sunken, framed by the dark bruises of exhaustion, and her hair was still slightly tangled from the wind of the ruin. She looked like a beggar who had wandered into a palace, a glitch in the matrix of the wealthy. But as the plane began to taxi, the sheer, violent contrast of the last 48 hours hit her like a physical blow. 2 nights ago, she had been shivering on a bus seat that smelled of ammonia and ancient tobacco, her head jolting against a cold window as she wondered if she would have enough money for a sandwich. She had been a widow without a home, a name without a legacy. Now, she was being hurtled into the stratosphere in a machine that cost more than the entire California estate Margaret and Vanessa were currently fighting over. The engines roared, a terrifying, beautiful sound of power, and then the earth let go. Amelia watched as Montana, the land of her humiliation, the land of the ruin, shrank until it was nothing more than a patchwork quilt of brown and gold. She watched the mountains turn into wrinkles on the skin of the world. She was suspended in the in-between. She was no longer a wife, for the man who made her one was ash and memory. She was no longer a homeowner, for the house she had loved was a fortress of enemies. She was a woman stripped of every label the world uses to identify a human being. She had no ID, no luggage, no certain future. She was nothing. And in that nothingness, she felt a piercing, agonizing freedom. "Is this what you wanted, Ethan?" she whispered, her voice lost in the pressurized hum of the cabin. "To strip me down until there was nothing left but the soul you loved?" She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The keening grief that had been her constant companion began to shift. It was no longer a sharp, jagged thing. It was a vast, oceanic ache. She thought of the way Ethan used to look at the stars, his eyes full of a strange, hungry melancholy. She realized now that he had always been living in two worlds. He had been a man building a bridge while the ground beneath him was crumbling. He had sacrificed his reputation in her heart to save her life. He had allowed her to think he was a coward, a failure, and a ghost who had forgotten his promises. Also, she could be sitting in this cabin, safe and invisible to those who would destroy her. The flight attendant reappeared, laying a soft, cashmere blanket over Amelia's lap. "We will be crossing the Atlantic in 4 hours, ma'am. Would you like to sleep?" "How did he do it?" Amelia asked, her voice a fragile thread. The woman paused, her expression softening into something truly human. Mr. Walker was a man who understood that the loudest things in the world are often the emptiest. He spent 10 years building the quiet. "You are the heart of that quiet, Mrs. Walker." Amelia turned her face away to hide the tears. The heart of the quiet. She spent the long hours over the ocean staring at the horizon where the dark blue of the sea met the lighter blue of the sky. She felt like a ghost crossing the river Styx, leaving behind the shores of the living to find the truth in the land of the dead. She thought of Margaret and Vanessa. At this very moment, they were likely sipping champagne in the California sun, counting the silver, oblivious to the fact that they had been given the dross while the gold was flying at 30,000 feet toward a destination they couldn't even map. They thought they had won because they held the keys to a house. They didn't realize that the house was a cage, and Amelia was the only one who had been given the sky. But the price of the sky was the silence of the man who gave it to her. Every mile they flew was a mile further from the version of Ethan she knew. The Ethan who worried about the lawn. The Ethan who liked old jazz. The Ethan who was just a businessman. That man was a beautiful lie. The man who owned this plane, the man who had built a secret study in a Montana ruin, the man who had manipulated international law like a grandmaster, that man was a stranger. A stranger who loved her enough to disappear. The plane began its long, slow descent over the jagged white teeth of the Alps. The sun was rising again. A European sun, cold and brilliant, reflecting off the glacial lakes of Switzerland. Amelia stood up and went to the small lavatory to wash her face. She splashed cold water on her skin and looked into the mirror. She didn't see a victim anymore. She saw a woman whose grief had been forged into a weapon. She was crossing into a new world with nothing. No suitcase, no identity, no certainty. She was a woman choosing faith over fear, walking into the fog because the man who loved her had told her there was light on the other side. As the wheels touched down on the private runway in Zurich with a gentle thud, the cabin phone rang once. The flight attendant picked it up, listened for a moment, and then looked at Amelia. "Mr. Harris is waiting for you on the tarmac, Mrs. Walker. He says to tell you, the winter is over." Amelia walked toward the door as it began to open. The Swiss air rushed in, crisp, biting, and smelling of snow and ancient stone. She didn't look back at the plane. She didn't look back at the ocean. She stepped out onto the metal stairs, a woman with nothing left but her heart, ready to meet the man who would tell her exactly what her husband had died to protect. The wind caught her hair, whipping it across her face, but she didn't flinch. For the first time in 7 days, the scent of the jasmine wasn't just a memory. It was a promise. She was no longer the widow of a quiet man. She was the heir to a secret that was about to shake the world. The Zurich air was a blade of ice, clean and unyielding, cutting through the remnants of Amelia's exhaustion as she descended the stairs. Waiting on the tarmac was a man who seemed carved from the same gray stone as the mountains. Jonathan Harris did not look like the slick, predatory lawyers of California. He wore a heavy wool overcoat and an expression of such profound, weary kindness that Amelia felt her defenses crumble before he even spoke. He didn't offer a handshake. He bowed his head, a silent acknowledgement of her journey, and whispered, "He missed you every single day he spent building this, Amelia." They drove in a car that moved like a whisper through the cobblestone streets of Zurich, passing the silent towering banks where the world's secrets are kept in vaults of steel and shadow. They stopped at a nondescript limestone building overlooking the Limmat River. Inside, the office was filled with the scent of old paper and beeswax, the smell of permanence. Jonathan sat across from her, placing a single thick leather ledger on the desk between them. "The funeral in California," Jonathan began, his voice a low gravel, "was a stage play. The will Mr. Sterling Reed was a work of fiction, a ghost ship designed to lure the scavengers away from the shore." Amelia leaned forward, her heart aching with a strange hollow rhythm. "They laughed, Jonathan. They laughed at the house in Montana. They laughed at me. They laughed at a shadow," Jonathan said, and for the first time, a small grim smile touched his lips. "The Walker Global your mother-in-law and sister-in-law are so desperately claiming is a hollowed-out husk. It is an empire of debt, built on leveraged loans and failing subsidiaries. Ethan spent the last 5 years quietly hollowing it out from the inside. He gave them exactly what they wanted: the name, the prestige, and the mansions. But those mansions are built on sand. Within a month, the banks will come. Within 2, they will be penniless." He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with accounts, land deeds, and corporate seals from Singapore to London, from Zurich to the Cayman Islands. "This," Jonathan said, tapping the paper, "is the reality. This is the true inheritance. Every real asset Ethan ever touched, the logistics empires, the technology patents, the emerald mines in Brazil, the real estate in Tokyo, it was all moved. It was never held by Walker Global. It was held by a private foundation called the Jasmine Trust." Amelia's breath caught at the name. "The beneficiary is you," Jonathan continued, his eyes searching hers. "Not as Ethan's widow. Not as a Walker. But as Amelia Thorne, your maiden name. He restored your identity before he left. You are, by a significant margin, one of the wealthiest women in this hemisphere. He didn't just leave you a fortune, Amelia. He left you a fortress that no one knows exists." Amelia looked at the numbers, the strings of zeros that looked like constellations on the page. She felt no triumph. No rush of power. She only felt a crushing, agonizing grief. "Why?" she sobbed, her hands covering her face. "Why the lies? Why let me feel so alone? Why let me believe he didn't care?" Jonathan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the cold, flowing river. "Because Margaret and Vanessa are not just greedy, Amelia. They are dangerous. They were part of the pressure that was killing him. If they knew he was moving the money, they would have tied him up in courts for decades. They would have destroyed you to get to it. Ethan knew he was dying long before he told you. He had to choose. He could stay, the good husband, and leave you to be torn apart by his family, or he could become the failure and ensure you were safe, invisible, and free." He turned back to her, his voice trembling with emotion. "He chose to let you hate him so you could live. He chose to be the villain in your story so that you could have a sequel." The truth was a heavy, suffocating weight. Every cold look she had received, every insult she had swallowed in California, was a shield Ethan had placed in front of her. The Montana house wasn't a joke. It was the trapdoor to this room. The nothing he left her was the only everything that mattered. "He died thinking I might never forgive him," Amelia whispered, her tears falling onto the ledger, blurring the ink of a $1 billion account. "No," Jonathan said softly. "He died knowing that you were brave enough to find the jasmine. He bet his entire legacy on your heart, Amelia. And you didn't let him down." She looked out at the Swiss sun reflecting off the water. She was standing in the center of an invisible empire, surrounded by the wealth of 1,000 lifetimes. But as she touched the silver compass around her neck, she realized the true inheritance wasn't the gold or the land. It was the terrifying, selfless depth of a love that was willing to be misunderstood until the very end. She wasn't a widow mourning a businessman. She was a woman standing in the wreckage of a sacrifice. The American dream she had lost was a cheap imitation. The European reality she had found was a cathedral built of silence and secrets. "What do I do now?" she asked, looking at the man who had been Ethan's ghost architect. "Now," Jonathan said, handing her a pen that felt as heavy as a sword. "You sign these. You step into the light he built for you. And we watch as the people who thought they broke you realize they only inherited the ashes." Amelia took the pen. Her hand was steady now. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but it was no longer a weight. It was a fuel. She thought of Margaret and Vanessa, celebrating their hollow victory in a house that was already sliding into the sea. She signed her name, Amelia Thorne, on the first document. She was no longer the woman who had been thrown into the rain. She was the woman who owned the storm. The apartment in Zurich was a sanctuary of glass and silver, perched so high above the city that the clouds seemed to brush against the balcony. It was a place of sterile beauty, but to Amelia, it felt like a waiting room for the dead. Jonathan Harris had left her with a small, sleek tablet and a glass of wine she hadn't touched. "When you're ready," he had said, his voice thick with a reverence that frightened her. He recorded this 3 days before the end. Amelia sat on the edge of the cream-colored sofa, the silence of the room pressing against her ears. The city lights below twinkled like cold diamonds, indifferent to the breaking of a human heart. With a hand that felt disconnected from her body, she pressed play. The screen flickered, and then there he was. Ethan. He was sitting in the hidden study in Montana, the very room she had stood in only 48 hours ago. But the man on the screen was a shadow of the husband she remembered. He was gaunt, his sweater hanging loosely on a frame that had been hollowed out by sickness and secrets. His eyes, however, those deep turbulent eyes, were burning with a desperate lucid fire. He looked at the camera for a long time without speaking. He simply breathed, a ragged whistling sound that made Amelia reach out and touch the cold glass of the screen. "Hi, Mel," he whispered. The sound of his voice, that low, gravelly hum that used to vibrate against her temple when they danced, shattered the last of her composure. She let out a sob that tore through her throat, her body doubling over as if she had been struck. "If you're seeing this," Ethan said, his voice trembling, "then you've found the jasmine. You've found Jonathan. And you've found the truth. I'm so sorry, Mel. I am so sorry for the way I had to leave you." He paused, coughing into a handkerchief that he quickly hid from the camera's view. "I watched them treat you like a stranger in our own home. I knew Margaret would take the silver, and Vanessa would take the cars, and they would both try to take your dignity. I knew they would throw you out into the rain. And the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than facing this cancer, harder than facing the end, was staying silent. I had to let them think they had won. I had to let the world believe I was a failure who had forgotten his wife." He leaned closer to the lens, his expression a haunting mixture of agony and adoration. "I saw you crying at my bedside, and I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell you that every penny, every brick, every drop of blood I had spent building my life was already yours. But I couldn't. If I had whispered the truth to you, you would have carried it in your eyes. They would have seen the hope in you, and they would have hunted you. They would have used the law to bleed you dry before you could ever reach Zurich." Amelia leaned her forehead against the screen, her tears blurring the image of his face. "Love," Ethan said, his voice breaking, "is a strange thing, Mel. We're taught that love is about holding on. But I learned that sometimes, love must look like loss. It must look like abandonment. It must look like a ruin in Montana. I had to strip you of everything so that no one would ever look for you. I had to make you invisible so that you could finally be safe." He took a shaky breath, his gaze drifting to something off camera, perhaps the jasmine plant she had seen. "The world thinks I left you with nothing. But I left you with the only thing they can't steal. A future where you don't have to look over your shoulder. You are the richest woman in their world, but more importantly, you are a woman they have no power over. You are free of the Walker name. You are free of their debt. You are just you." He smiled then, a faint, ghost-like trace of the grin that had won her heart years ago in a rainy park in Seattle. "Don't spend your life hating them, Mel. They are already dead, they just don't know it yet. They inherited a house of cards, and the wind is coming. Spend your life living by the vineyard we talked about. Travel to the places I only showed you on maps. Find a way to laugh again, even if it's not with me." His voice dropped to a whisper, so soft she had to hold the tablet to her ear. "I'll be in the wind in Montana. I'll be in the scent of the jasmine. I loved you in the silence, Amelia. I loved you when I was being cruel. I loved you when I was leaving. I will love you until the stars go dark." The screen went black. The silence that followed was different than before. It was no longer empty. It was full of him. Amelia sat in the dark apartment, the tablet clutched to her chest as if it were his heart. She felt the weight of the sacrifice, the sheer terrifying loneliness Ethan must have felt, playing the villain in his own life to ensure she could have a hero's ending. She realized then that the seventh day wasn't the end of her mourning. It was the birth of her purpose. He had given her a kingdom built of secrets, and she would rule it with the same quiet strength he had shown. She stood up and walked to the window. Across the ocean, in a mansion in California, two women were likely celebrating a victory that was actually a grave. But here, in the cold, honest air of the Alps, Amelia Thorne breathed in the scent of a love that had survived the impossible. "I forgive you, Ethan," she whispered into the night. "And I promise, I will make the silence roar." The sun in California was a deceptive thing. Bright, golden, and utterly indifferent to the rot beneath the surface. In the grand estate that had once been Ethan and Amelia's home, the air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne and the sharp metallic tang of triumph. Margaret Walker sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her fingers tracing the rim of a crystal flute as if it were a trophy. Across from her, Vanessa was flipping through a luxury catalogue, her laughter ringing out like a discordant bell. "To the departure of the grey mouse," Vanessa toasted, her eyes glinting with a sharp, predatory satisfaction. "To a house finally cleansed of the common." They were surrounded by the spoils of their war. The paintings had been reappraised, the silver polished, and the locks changed. They believed they had won. They believed that by casting Amelia into the mud of Montana, they had secured their place in a sun-drenched forever. But justice, when it comes for the greedy, does not arrive with a fanfare of trumpets. It arrives like a tide, slow, silent, and impossible to stop. The first tremor came in the form of a black sedan pulling into the driveway. Then another. And another. Margaret frowned, setting her glass down. Who invited the press? Or are those the appraisers from Sotheby's? The men who stepped out of the cars did not carry gavels or cameras. They carried briefcases and the cold, clinical expressions of executioners. When the front door opened, the same door that had slammed shut against Amelia's back, it wasn't a guest who entered. It was a phalanx of federal marshals and bank liquidators. "Mrs. Margaret Walker?" the lead man asked, his voice as dry as a desert wind. "I am here on behalf of the creditors' consortium. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Walker Global has been declared insolvent. All primary and secondary assets are being seized to cover the matured debt." The champagne flute slipped from Margaret's hand. It shattered on the marble floor, the liquid spreading like a pale, expensive bloodstain. "Debt!" Vanessa shrieked, standing up so fast her chair toppled. "That's impossible. Ethan was worth billions. This house is worth 30 million alone." "This house," the official said, pulling a document from his folder with the precision of a surgeon, "was used as collateral for a series of high-risk loans 3 years ago. The loans have defaulted. The interest alone exceeds the value of the property. Your brother did not leave you an inheritance, Ms. Walker. He left you a liability." The next hour was a symphony of quiet destruction. Amelia, watching from a screen in Zurich half a world away, saw the scene unfold through the lenses of the news cameras gathered at the gate. She sat in the silence of her Swiss sanctuary, her heart not filled with the heat of revenge, but with a cold, hollow sadness. She watched as the men in suits began to tag the furniture. The estate assets that Margaret had so cruelly snatched away, the hand-carved wooden bird, the velvet curtains, the antique vases, were now being carried out by strangers. They were no longer symbols of a family's pride. They were line items in a bankruptcy filing. Margaret and Vanessa were marched out into the blinding California sun. There was no dignity in their exit. Vanessa was hysterical, clutching a designer handbag as if it could save her, while Margaret walked with a hollow, wide-eyed stare, her carefully curated mask of nobility finally cracking to reveal the terrified, fragile old woman beneath. The cameras flashed, capturing every moment of their fall. The world watched as the Walkers were stripped of the life they thought they had earned through cruelty. They had traded their souls for a house made of glass, and Ethan had simply waited for the sun to hit it at the right angle. "He didn't destroy them," Jonathan Harris whispered, standing behind Amelia. "He simply stopped holding the walls up. He let their own greed become the weight that crushed them." Amelia watched the screen until the grand doors of the California mansion were boarded up with the same rotting plywood they had mocked in Montana. The irony was a jagged blade in her chest. She thought of the rainy night she had stood on that same driveway, soaked and broken. She had left that house with nothing but her heart, And in doing so, she had kept everything. Margaret and Vanessa had clung to the stone and the silk, and now they had nothing. Not even each other. As the news feed cut to a commercial, Amelia looked down at her hands. They were steady. She felt the weight of the silver compass around her neck. Justice was not a scream. It was a silence so profound it allowed you to finally hear the truth. Ethan had let them take the Walker name because he knew it was a cursed thing. He had saved the Amelia, because she was the only part of his life that was ever real. The debt was paid. The accounts were closed. Back in the California driveway, as the last of the trucks pulled away, a single white petal from a neglected flower bed drifted across the asphalt, settling on the spot where Amelia's suitcase had once sat in the mud. The house was empty. The lights were out. The Walkers were gone. And in Zurich, a woman who had once been a ghost stood up and walked toward the window, ready to finally step out of the shadow of the man who had loved her in the dark.